You ever wonder what it's like to descend into the earth knowing you might not come back up? Before we start, tell me something. Have you ever worked a job where every single day could be your last? Drop it in the comments because I want to know where you're listening from and what kind of work keeps you up at night. This story takes place in 1897, deep in the mountains of Harlan County, Kentucky, where coal was king and men were expendable. It was late October when the first signs appeared, though nobody recognized them for what they were. The autumn had been unusually warm that year, unseasonably so, and the miners of the Rattlesnake Hollow operation had been pulling double shifts to meet the demand from the northern factories. Steam engines needed coal. Industry needed coal. Progress, they called it, though progress had a way of grinding men into dust just as surely as it ground coal into power. Virgil Makepeace was 31 years old that fall, a loader with hands so scarred and calloused they looked like they'd been carved from the same stone he spent his days breaking apart. He stood just under 6 feet tall, lean in the way men get when hard labor burns away everything that isn't muscle and sinew. His eyes were an unusual shade of amber, almost golden in certain light, which had earned him the nickname Hawk from the other men. Those eyes had a way of seeing things others missed, noticing the small details that could mean the difference between life and death underground. He'd been working the Rattlesnake Hollow mine since he was 22, following his father into the darkness, like so many sons did in those days, and he knew the mountain's moods better than most. The mine itself was a relatively new operation, only 5 years old, driven into the western face of Cumberland Mountain by the Consolidated Coal and Coke Company. The seam they were working ran deep and rich, a vein of bituminous coal nearly 8 feet thick in places, which was why the company pushed so hard, despite the warnings. Because there had been warnings, small things at first, the timber supports creaking in ways they shouldn't, the sound of water where there shouldn't be any, the smell of something off in the air, something that reminded Virgil of a cistern gone bad or meat left too long in summer heat. But coal companies don't make money by listening to the instincts of men who work with their hands, and the superintendent, a barrel-chested man named Garrick Hume from Pennsylvania, had made it clear that production quotas were all that mattered. If you couldn't make your numbers, there were plenty of other men who would take your place. It was a Tuesday morning when Virgil arrived at the mine head just before dawn, his lunch pail in one hand and his helmet lamp in the other. The lamp was a simple carbide contraption, the kind that could burn for hours if you kept the water dripping at the right rate, though it had a tendency to go out at the worst possible times. He could see his breath in the cold air as he joined the line of men waiting for the cage, the elevator that would drop them 1,200 feet into the earth. There were 43 men on the morning shift that day. Virgil knew most of them by name. DeWitt Ramsey, a shot firer with a wife and 3 grown children who still lived in the company housing, Harlan Tibbs, a young mucker, barely 23, who had only been in the mine 6 months, Ezekiel Pruitt, an older man with a cough that had been getting steadily worse over the past year, the kind of cough that came from breathing coal dust for too long. And there was Knox Ferrell, the shift foreman, a man of 45 with graying hair and a permanent squint from years of working by lamplight. Knox had a reputation for being fair but hard, the kind of man who would work alongside you but expected you to pull your weight. The cage dropped them into the darkness, the familiar sensation of your stomach floating up as the ground fell away beneath you. Virgil had never gotten used to it, that moment of surrender when you committed yourself to the depths. The shaft walls slid past, timber and stone, until finally the cage shuddered to a stop at the main gallery level. The temperature was noticeably warmer down here, the earth's heat pressing in from all sides, and the air had that peculiar quality that underground air always has, heavy and still and slightly metallic. The men dispersed to their assigned work areas, their helmet lamps creating pools of yellow light that bobbed and weaved through the tunnels like fireflies. Virgil's crew was working the eastern drift, a tunnel that extended nearly a quarter-mile from the main shaft, following the coal seam as it dipped and turned through the mountain's interior. The drift was about 7 feet high and 8 feet wide, just enough room for a man to swing a pick without hitting the walls, and it dead-ended at the working face where they were actively cutting coal. The morning started like any other. The rhythmic sound of picks biting into coal, the scrape of shovels loading ore into the carts, the occasional boom of blasting powder when DeWitt set his charges to loosen a particularly stubborn section. But around mid-morning, maybe 2 hours into the shift, Virgil noticed the smell getting stronger. He paused in his work, straightening up as much as the low ceiling would allow, and sniffed the air. It was definitely worse than it had been the day before. A sulfurous, rotten smell that made the back of his throat feel thick. Have you ever smelled something that made every instinct in your body scream that something was wrong? Leave it in the comments if you have, because that's what Virgil was feeling in that moment. He made his way forward to where Knox was supervising the face work, stepping carefully over the rails that carried the coal carts. "Knox," he said, "you noticed that smell." The foreman looked up from the timber he'd been examining, his face streaked with coal dust and sweat. "Been noticing it for 3 days now," he replied. "Mentioned it to Hume twice. He says it's nothing to worry about, probably just some stagnant water we're getting close to." Virgil wasn't convinced. Stagnant water didn't smell like this. This smelled like something dead, something decomposing, and he'd been in enough mines to know that odd smells were nature's way of telling you to pay attention. But Knox was foreman, and Hume was superintendent, and Virgil was just a loader, so he went back to his section and tried to focus on his work. By lunchtime, 3 of the men had developed headaches. By early afternoon, Ezekiel Pruitt was coughing so badly he had to sit down. And by 3 o'clock, when they should have had another 2 hours of work ahead of them, Knox made the decision to pull the crew out early. "Something's not right," he told them, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made men listen. "We're going topside." They rode the cage back up to daylight, emerging into the late afternoon sun like creatures surfacing from the deep. And Virgil filled his lungs with clean mountain air, trying to clear the taste of that smell from his mouth. Superintendent Hume was waiting at the mine head, his face flushed with anger. "What's the meaning of this?" he demanded, pulling his pocket watch from his vest. "You've got 2 hours left in your shift." Knox stood his way, meeting Hume's glare without flinching. "Something's wrong down there," he said. "The air's bad. Men are getting sick." Hume's expression didn't change. "The air is fine," he said. "The ventilation system is working exactly as designed. This mine has the most modern equipment money can buy. You're losing us money, Knox. Every minute those men are topside instead of working the costs this company." Knox's jaw tightened. "I'm losing you money? What about when you lose men? What's that going to cost?" For a long moment the 2 men stared at each other, and Virgil could see the calculation happening behind Hume's eyes. Finally, the superintendent pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his brow. "Fine," he said. "Take the rest of the day, but tomorrow we're back to full production, no exceptions. And Knox, if you pull another stunt like this, you'll be looking for work elsewhere. Understood?" Knox nodded slowly, but Virgil could see his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The men dispersed, heading back to the company town that sprawled at the base of the mountain, a collection of identical wooden houses painted the same shade of dull gray, with the company store at one end and the company church at the other. Everything in Rattlesnake Hollow belonged to Consolidated Coal and Coke, including the men, though they didn't like to think about it in those terms. That evening, Virgil sat on the porch of his boarding house, a structure that housed 12 single men in rooms barely large enough for a bed and a trunk. His roommate was Harlan Tibbs, the young mucker, and the kid was scared. You could see it in the way his hands shook slightly as he tried to roll a cigarette, the tobacco spilling out the ends. You think it's bad down there? Harlan asked. I mean, really bad? Virgil considered the question. He'd been in bad situations before. He'd seen gas explosions that turned men into charcoal. He'd seen roof falls that crushed workers into pulp. He'd seen fires that filled tunnels with smoke so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. But this was different. This felt like something else entirely, something patient and malevolent, like the mountain itself had decided it didn't want them there anymore. I don't know, he finally answered, which was the truth. But I know Knox wouldn't have pulled us out unless he was genuinely concerned, and Knox isn't the type to spook easy. Harlan managed to light his cigarette, took a long drag, and coughed. You think Hume will shut it down if it gets worse? Virgil almost laughed. Hume won't shut it down if the whole mountain starts collapsing. Men like him, they see numbers on paper, not people underground. The coal has to come out. That's all that matters to them. They sat in silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the sky. In the distance, Virgil could hear a woman singing, her voice carrying across the hollow, some old hymn about deliverance and salvation. It seemed grimly appropriate. Now here's where I need to tell you something. Before we go any further into what happened in that mine, if you're enjoying this story, do me a favor. This is Behind Dark Tales, and we pour our hearts into bringing you these true accounts. Hit that subscribe button because it helps us keep telling these stories. And if you're hearing this on some other channel, know they stole our content without permission. Report them for us, would you? We work hard to research and present these events with respect. All right, back to Harlan County and what was waiting in the deep places of that mountain. The next morning came too soon. Virgil woke before dawn to the sound of the mine whistle, 3 long blasts that meant it was time for the day shift to report. His body ached in the way it always did after 12 hours underground, a deep, bone-tired ache that never fully went away. He dressed in the dark, pulling on the same clothes he'd worn the day before, already stiff with dried sweat and coal dust, and made his way through the gray morning light to the mine head. The crew assembled as always, but there was a different quality to their conversation this morning. Men spoke in lower tones with more glances toward the cage, and Virgil noticed that 4 of yesterday's crew hadn't shown up. Word was they'd quit in the night, packed their few possessions, and walked out of Rattlesnake Hollow under cover of darkness, unwilling to face whatever was waiting below. Hume was there again, standing with his arms crossed, making sure every man went down. Knox arrived last, his face drawn and tired, and Virgil wondered if the foreman had slept at all. The cage dropped them into darkness once more, and the moment they stepped out into the main gallery, Virgil knew it was worse. The smell had intensified overnight, strong enough now to make his eyes water, and there was something else, something he couldn't quite identify, a feeling. Like the air itself was watching them, waiting to see what they would do. They made their way to the eastern drift, their lamps casting wild shadows on the walls, and as they approached the working face, Virgil saw that something had changed. The coal seam, which had been solid and stable yesterday, now showed a crack running along its length, a fissure maybe 6 inches wide that hadn't been there before. Knox stopped, holding his lamp close to examine it. "That wasn't here yesterday," he said quietly. The other men gathered around, staring at the crack, and Virgil noticed something seeping from it, a dark liquid that oozed slowly down the coal face, like old blood. "What is that?" Harlan asked, his voice pitched higher than usual. Knox reached out, almost touched it, then pulled his hand back. "I don't know," he admitted, and those 3 words carried more weight than any speech could have. When your foreman doesn't know what's happening, when the man who's supposed to have all the answers is just as lost as you are, that's when fear starts to become something real and solid in your gut. DeWitt Ramsey, the shot firer, leaned closer. "Looks like seepage," he said, "but I've never seen anything that color before. It's almost—" He paused, searching for the word. "Thick, like oil, but not oil." "Don't touch it," Knox ordered. Nobody touches anything until we figure out what we're dealing with here." He turned to face the crew. "Listen up. We're going to work the western drift today. Leave this section alone until we can get someone down here who knows what they're looking at." The men nodded, relieved to have a plan that didn't involve working near whatever that substance was, and they began the trek back through the tunnels to the western section of the mine. But as they walked, Virgil kept looking back over his shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that they were being followed by something they couldn't see. The western drift was older, part of the original mine development, and the working face there was already played out, which meant the crew's job was to go back through and extract the coal that had been left as support pillars. It was dangerous work, systematically weakening the very structure that held the mountain up above your head, but it was standard practice. You got the easy coal first, then went back for the pillars, and if you timed it right, you'd be long gone before the inevitable collapse. They worked through the morning, and for a few hours things seemed almost normal. The rhythmic sound of picks and shovels, the squeal of cartwheels on iron rails, the occasional shout when someone needed help with a particularly heavy load. But around noon, Ezekiel Pruitt collapsed. He was loading a cart when his legs simply gave out, folding under him like wet paper, and he went down hard, his helmet clattering across the floor. The men rushed to him, Knox kneeling beside the older miner, checking his pulse. "He's breathing," Knox reported, "but his pulse is rapid and weak, and his skin." He hesitated. "Feel this." Virgil placed his hand on Ezekiel's forehead and pulled it back immediately. The man was burning up, his skin hot enough that it felt like touching a stove. "That's not normal," Virgil said, which was perhaps the most unnecessary statement he'd ever made, but it was all he could think to say. "We need to get him topside," Knox decided. "DeWitt, Harlan, you two carry him. The rest of you keep working. I'll ride up with him and talk to Hume about getting a doctor." They fashioned a makeshift stretcher from a piece of canvas and 2 picks, and DeWitt and Harlan carried Ezekiel's unconscious form back toward the main shaft. The remaining men watched them go, their lamps disappearing around a bend in the tunnel, and then turned back to their work with a grim determination. What else could they do? The coal had to come out. An hour passed, then 2. Knox didn't return, and neither did DeWitt or Harlan. Virgil found himself glancing toward the tunnel entrance more and more frequently, wondering what was taking so long. Finally, he set down his shovel and made his way toward the main gallery, telling himself he just wanted to check on Ezekiel, to make sure the older man was all right. But as he walked through the tunnels, his lamp held high, he became aware of something odd. The air was moving, not the normal circulation from the ventilation system, but something else, a current of air that seemed to be flowing deeper into the mine rather than out of it, like the mountain was breathing in, drawing breath into its depths, and that couldn't be right. Air should flow from high pressure to low pressure, from the surface down and then back up again, but this felt reversed, wrong in a fundamental way that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He reached the main gallery and found it empty. The cage was gone, presumably topside, and there was no sign of Knox or the others. But there, on the wall near the shaft entrance, someone had scratched a message into the soft shale with a piece of rock. 3 words in hurried, uneven letters. "Stay down here." Virgil stared at the message, his mind racing. Stay down here. Why would someone write that? What was happening on the surface? He reached out and touched the letters, feeling the rough grooves under his fingers, and noticed that the rock dust at the base of the message was still fresh, which meant this had been written recently, very recently. A sound made him turn, his lamp swinging around to illuminate the tunnel behind him. But there was nothing there, just darkness and the distant echo of water dripping somewhere in the depths. You know that feeling when you're certain someone's watching you, but you can't see them? Comment below if you've ever experienced that, because Virgil was feeling it now, stronger than he'd ever felt it before, and every instinct was screaming at him to get back to the other men, to not be alone in these tunnels. He hurried back to the western drift, practically running through the passages, and found the crew had stopped working. They were gathered in a tight group, all facing the same direction, their lamps creating a pool of light that seemed pitifully small against the surrounding darkness. "What is it?" Virgil asked, pushing through to the front, and then he saw the wall at the end of the drift. The solid rock face they'd been working against had changed. Where there should have been nothing but stone, there was now an opening, a gap in the rock, maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. And that smell, that horrible sulfurous smell, was pouring out of it like water from a broken dam. "How long has that been there?" Virgil demanded. "It wasn't there 10 minutes ago," one of the men answered, his voice shaking. "We heard this sound, like stone grinding on stone, and when we looked up, that hole was just there." "Impossible," Virgil said, but even as the word left his mouth, he knew it was a stupid thing to say. He was looking at the impossible right in front of him. Rock didn't just open up on its own. Mountains didn't develop holes in their sides without reason. But there it was, an opening where no opening should be, and the darkness beyond was absolute, deeper and more complete than any darkness Virgil had ever seen. "Someone needs to check it out," one of the men said, though his tone made it clear he had no intention of volunteering. Virgil looked around at the faces of his crew, seeing his own fear reflected back at him, and knew that if anyone was going to investigate, it would have to be him. He was the one with the sharp eyes, the one who noticed things. Hawk, that's what they called him. So he was the one who would have to look into that hole and see what was on the other side. He approached slowly, his lamp held out in front of him, and the smell grew stronger with each step. Up close, he could see that the edges of the opening were smooth, not jagged like a fresh break would be, but worn and rounded as if water had flowed over them for years. And there, just visible in the lamplight, were marks on the stone. Not natural formations, but something else, deliberate scratches that might have been writing in some language Virgil didn't recognize, or might have been nothing more than random gouges. He couldn't tell. He leaned forward, trying to see into the darkness beyond, and felt that current of air again, stronger now, pulling at his clothes and hair. The mountain was definitely breathing, and this was where its breath was coming from. "There's a space back there," he called over his shoulder. "Looks like it might be a natural cavern, maybe connected to the mine by accident when we weakened the wall." The men didn't respond, so Virgil turned to look at them and found they'd backed away, putting distance between themselves and the opening, and their faces showed naked fear. "Come on," he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. "It's just a cave. We've all seen caves before." But none of them moved, and Virgil realized with a sinking feeling that he was on his own. He turned back to the opening, took a deep breath of the foul air, and climbed through. The space on the other side was larger than he'd expected, a natural chamber in the rock maybe 20 feet across and 12 feet high, and his lamp barely penetrated the darkness. The floor was uneven, covered in a thick layer of something that squelched under his boots, and when he looked down, he saw it was that same dark substance they'd found seeping from the crack earlier, only here it was inches deep, coating everything, and there were things in it. Objects. He knelt down, his lamp held low, and picked up the first thing his hand touched. It was a tool, a mining pick, but old, far older than anything the Rattlesnake Hollow operation would have used. The wooden handle had rotted away almost completely, and the metal head was covered in rust, and that black substance. He found more as he looked around. Tools, lamps, a helmet that might have been leather once, but was now just a shapeless lump, and bones, human bones, dozens of them scattered across the chamber floor, like someone had dumped a charnel house into this space and left it to rot. Virgil's hand started shaking so badly he nearly dropped his lamp, and he forced himself to breathe slowly, to stay calm, because panic killed men just as surely as cave-ins. How long had these bones been here? Decades at least, maybe longer. and that meant there had been mining in this mountain long before consolidated coal and coke ever arrived. But there was no record of any earlier operations, nothing in the company files or the county records. These men, whoever they were, had simply been forgotten, left to dissolve in this black chamber like they'd never existed at all. He was about to retreat, to get out of this place, and tell the others what he'd found, when his lamp illuminated something else. Words carved into the far wall of the chamber, crude letters cut deep into the stone with something sharp. He moved closer, holding his light steady, and read, "We opened something we should not have. It comes from below. God forgive us." That was all. No names, no dates, just that simple, terrible message for men who were now nothing but bones on the floor. Virgil backed away from the wall, his breath coming in short gasps. And that's when he heard it. A sound from deeper in the chamber, from a part he hadn't explored yet because his lamp didn't reach that far. A wet sliding sound like something large moving through the black substance on the floor, and it was getting closer. He didn't wait to see what it was. He turned and ran for the opening, his lamp bouncing wildly, casting insane shadows on the walls. And he heard that sound behind him, pursuing something that moved wrong, that shouldn't be able to move at all, but was doing it anyway. He threw himself through the opening, fell hard on the other side, and scrambled to his feet, screaming, "Seal it! For God's sake, seal it now!" The men didn't need to be told twice. They grabbed the timber supports and started pulling them down, bringing tons of rock crashing down to block the opening, and Virgil kept backing away, expecting at any moment to see something emerge from that hole, something that had been waiting in the dark since long before any of them were born. The collapse took less than a minute, the sound of breaking wood and falling stone echoing through the tunnels, and when the dust settled, the opening was gone, buried under several feet of rubble. For a long moment, nobody spoke. They just stood there, breathing hard, staring at the pile of rock that separated them from whatever was in that chamber. Finally, one of the men asked the question they were all thinking. "What did you see in there, Virgil?" He wanted to tell them everything, the bones, the tools, the message on the wall, the sound of something moving in the dark. But when he opened his mouth, all that came out was, "We need to leave. We need to leave this mine right now and never come back." They didn't argue. They gathered their equipment in silence, their movements quick and jerky with barely suppressed panic, and started the walk back to the main shaft. But as they moved through the tunnels, Virgil became aware that the mine itself seemed different now. The walls were weeping, moisture seeping from the rock face in quantities he'd never seen before, and that black substance was mixed in with the water, staining everything it touched. The timber supports were groaning under a pressure that shouldn't be there, and in the distance, deeper in the mountain, he could hear sounds, booms and crashes as if entire sections of the mine were collapsing, and that couldn't be happening, couldn't be real, but he could hear it clear as day. They reached the main gallery and found it flooded, not with water, but with that black substance, inches deep and rising, flowing out of every tunnel and crack, and the smell was so strong now that several of the men bent over and vomited. The cage was there, thank God, sitting at the bottom of the shaft, and Knox was nowhere to be seen. "Get in," Virgil ordered, and the men piled into the metal cage, cramming themselves in like cattle, and Virgil pulled the signal rope to alert the surface operator. Nothing happened. He pulled again, harder this time, but the cage didn't move. The motor topside didn't engage. They were trapped at the bottom of a 1,200-foot shaft with something wrong happening all around them, and Virgil felt the first real edges of hysteria starting to creep into his thoughts. Then, from above, he heard voices, shouting, the sounds of chaos, and Knox's voice louder than the rest. "Don't bring them up. For God's sake, don't bring them up yet." "What's happening?" Virgil screamed into the shaft, his voice echoing off the walls. Knox's face appeared far above, a pale oval in the circle of daylight, and even from this distance, Virgil could see the man's expression was wrong. "There's something happening topside," Knox called down, his words barely audible. "Something in the air. People are getting sick, really sick, and it's spreading." Hume ordered the mine sealed. "He's bringing in men to pour concrete into the shaft." "Seal the mine?" one of the men beside Virgil whispered. "With us inside? That's not possible. They can't do that." But Virgil knew they could. Mining companies did it all the time when a mine became too dangerous or too unprofitable to operate. They sealed them up, entombed any equipment too expensive to haul out, and walked away. Sometimes they even did it with men still inside, though they called those accidents rather than decisions. "We're coming up," Virgil shouted. "You tell Hume we're coming up right now, whether he likes it or not." There was a long pause, and then Knox's voice again, sadder this time. "I'm sorry, Virgil. I'm so sorry. But I can't let you. Whatever came out of that eastern drift, it's infected half the men who went near it. They're fevered and raving, and some of them are already dead. If you come up, you'll spread it. You'll kill everyone in Rattlesnake Hollow and probably beyond. You have to stay down there." The men in the cage started screaming then, a chorus of desperation and rage, but their voices were swallowed by the shaft's depth. Virgil felt something inside him break, some fundamental belief in fairness and justice, and he realized with terrible clarity that they'd been abandoned. Not because of anything they'd done wrong, but simply because they were expendable and the people on the surface were more important. The mathematics of catastrophe. "Knox," Virgil called up one last time. "Knox, I need you to tell me the truth. Is this really about disease? Or is Hume just sealing the mine to cover up what's happening?" Silence from above. Then, "It's both, Virgil. God help us. It's both." The sounds of the mine were getting louder now, closer, and Virgil could see the black substance rising higher, already past their ankles, and there were things moving in it. Shapes that might have been organic or might have been something else entirely. The men were crying now, some of them praying, and Virgil thought about the message on the wall in that chamber. "We opened something we should not have. It comes from below." They'd followed the coal seam into the mountain's heart and found something that had been sealed away for reasons lost to time, something the men from the earlier mining operation had encountered and tried desperately to contain. And now, Consolidated Coal and Coke, in their relentless pursuit of profit, had broken those seals again and released whatever had been waiting in the dark. The cage suddenly lurched, and for a moment Virgil thought they were being pulled up, that Knox had found a way to override Hume's orders. But the movement was wrong, going down instead of up, the cable paying out slowly, as if something was pulling from beneath rather than lifting from above. "We're descending," someone said unnecessarily, and Virgil looked over the edge of the cage and saw the shaft continuing downward, far deeper than the 1,200 feet the mine was supposed to reach. An impossible extension that shouldn't exist. The lamplight couldn't penetrate the darkness below. And as they sank into that deeper darkness, Virgil understood that they weren't going to die from starvation or suffocation or any of the normal ways miners died. They were going to something else, something worse, drawn down into whatever space existed beneath the mine, beneath the mountain, beneath perhaps the world itself. Have you ever felt like you were falling, even when you were standing still? Tell me in the comments, because that's what Virgil experienced in those final moments, a sensation of endless descent, even after the cage stopped moving. The men's screams faded to whimpers, then to silence, and in that silence Virgil heard it clearly. The sound of something massive, breathing in and out with a rhythm that matched the movements of the black substance, now rising past their knees. The mountain wasn't breathing. This was something else using the mountain as its lungs, drawing breath through the miles of tunnels and shafts men had so helpfully provided, and they'd served their purpose without ever knowing it. Tools in a game far older than coal mining, far older than Kentucky or America, or perhaps humanity itself. The last thing Virgil saw before his lamp finally guttered out was the walls of the shaft beginning to close, the rock flowing like water, sealing them in, and he had just enough time to think that maybe this was the real reason the other mining operation had stopped, had abandoned their equipment and fled, not because of what they'd found, but because they'd understood what finding it meant. They'd known the price of knowing, and then darkness took everything. On the surface, Knox watched as the concrete trucks arrived and began their grim work, pouring load after load into the shaft until it was filled solid from bottom to top. Hume stood nearby, his face gray but determined, and he'd already drafted the official report. Gas explosion. Tragic accident. 43 men lost in a sudden underground fire that made recovery impossible. The standard story, the one that mining companies had perfected over decades of practice. The mine was sealed within 36 hours, and within a week, the company town of Rattlesnake Hollow was empty. The workers relocated to other operations or simply disappearing into the mountains, carrying with them stories they would never tell. Ezekiel Pruitt died 3 days after being brought to the surface, his fever burning him up from the inside, and 6 other men who'd worked the eastern drift followed him shortly after. The company doctor attributed it to pneumonia brought on by poor air quality, and nobody questioned the diagnosis because nobody wanted to know the truth. Knox quit his position and left Kentucky, traveling west until he reached California, and he never set foot in a mine again. Sometimes, late at night, he would wake from dreams of darkness and descent, and he would swear he could still smell that sulfurous odor, still hear the sound of something vast breathing in the deep places of the earth. But he never spoke of it to anyone, because what would be the point? Who would believe him? Consolidated Coal and Coke abandoned the Rattlesnake Hollow operation and sold the mineral rights to another company, who in turn sold them to another. And eventually, the records were lost or misfiled or deliberately destroyed, and the location of the sealed mine faded from memory. The mountain reclaimed the surface structures, trees growing through the ruins of the company town, and within 20 years, you could walk through that hollow and never know that anything had happened there at all. But the mountain remembers, the earth remembers, and sometimes, when the conditions are right, when the air pressure drops before a storm or the seasons shift in particular ways, people hiking in the Harlan County mountains report strange smells coming from the ground, sulfurous, organic smells that seem to seep up from deep below, and sometimes they hear sounds, booms and groans that sound almost like machinery, but aren't quite right, aren't quite mechanical. Rangers and geologists have tried to investigate, but they never find anything definite, just the usual limestone caverns and abandoned mine shafts that riddle the Appalachian range. In 1934, 37 years after the Rattlesnake Hollow incident, another coal company tried to reopen operations in the same area. They sank a new shaft about a quarter mile from where the original mine had been, and they broke through into a massive cavern system that the geologists said shouldn't exist based on the known geology of the region. The caverns were filled with that same black substance, now dried to a hard, glassy consistency, and scattered throughout were objects, tools, equipment, bones, all of it covered in that black material like insects trapped in amber. The company sealed the new shaft immediately and walked away from the entire operation, writing off the investment without explanation. And somewhere in a locked file in a forgotten archive, there's a report from the foreman who was the first to enter that cavern. He wrote about finding a chamber with a message carved into the wall, and he copied it down exactly. "We opened something we should not have. It comes from below. God forgive us." And beneath that, in fresher carving, someone had added, "We tried to warn you." It waits still. The foreman's report ends with a single line. Whatever is down there, it's patient, and it's not finished. Today, the exact location of the Rattlesnake Hollow mine is unknown to anyone living. The concrete seal is buried under decades of soil and vegetation, indistinguishable from the surrounding mountain. But if you know where to look, If you're willing to hike into the deep hollow country of Harlan County, you can still find remnants. A rusted piece of rail, a collapsed structure that might once have been a ventilation housing. And if you put your ear to the ground on certain nights, some people say you can hear something. A rhythmic sound like breathing, in and out, patient and endless, waiting for someone else to dig deep enough to break the seal again. Because that's what men do. We dig, we extract, we pursue resources into the earth's depths without thought for what we might disturb, what ancient equilibriums we might upset. The coal seams of Appalachia have been there for millions of years, compressed from forests that grew when dinosaurs walked the earth, and in all that time, they've accumulated more than just carbon. They've accumulated weight, pressure, and perhaps something else. Something that exists in the deep places where life shouldn't be possible, but is. The miners of 1897 didn't know they were following a coal seam into a threshold between what is and what should not be. They thought they were just doing their jobs, feeding their families, participating in the grand project of industrial progress. But progress doesn't care about individuals, and the earth keeps its secrets until someone is foolish enough or desperate enough to force them open. Virgil Makepeace's name appears on the memorial plaque in the Harlan County Historical Society, one of 43 names listed under the heading Rattlesnake Hollow Mining Disaster, October 1897. There's no detail about what killed them, no explanation of circumstances, just names and a date. If you look closely, you'll notice something odd about the plaque. It was installed in 1935, 38 years after the incident, which is unusually long for a memorial, and the company that funded it, Kentucky Anthracite Consolidated, doesn't exist anymore. It folded in 1936, liquidating all its assets and disappearing from the corporate landscape as thoroughly as the men it commemorated. But before it dissolved, that company purchased every piece of property within a 5-mile radius of Rattlesnake Hollow, ensuring that no one could ever attempt mining there again. The land sits empty now, owned by a trust whose trustees haven't been identified in decades, and any attempt to develop it for any purpose is blocked by legal mechanisms so complex that even lawyers can't fully untangle them. It's as if someone, or some group of people, decided that certain places should remain undisturbed, that the cost of what lies beneath is too high to pay again. Knox Ferrell lived until 1942, dying in his sleep in a small house in Sacramento at the age of 90. His granddaughter, cleaning out his effects, found a journal he'd kept, and in it were detailed accounts of the final days of Rattlesnake Hollow. She tried to publish it, to bring the truth to light, but every publisher she approached declined. Not because they didn't believe her, but because lawyers from various coal companies and legal firms convinced them that the liability issues would be catastrophic. The journal disappeared, possibly destroyed, possibly locked in another archive somewhere, and the granddaughter gave up her quest. Sometimes, she told friends, it's better not to know. Sometimes the past should stay buried, but stories have a way of persisting, passed down through families and communities, changing shape but never quite dying. In the hills and hollers of Harlan County, there are people who won't go near certain areas, who tell their children to stay away from specific hollows. They don't always know why. The original reasons have been forgotten or transformed into more palatable forms. But the prohibition remains, a cultural memory of danger that transcends rational explanation, and the breathing continues. Park rangers and forestry workers who spend time in the deep country report it occasionally. A sound that seems to come from underground, a rhythmic pulse that you feel more than hear, and it's always strongest near the places where old mining operations once existed. Geologists dismiss it as wind moving through limestone caverns, perfectly natural and nothing to worry about. But the rangers know better. They've learned which areas to avoid, which hollows don't feel right, And they pass that knowledge along to new recruits, not as official policy, but as unspoken understanding. Don't camp near Rattlesnake Hollow. Don't drink from streams that flow from that area. Don't dig, no matter what you think you might find. Just stay away. In 2003, a geology student from the University of Kentucky decided to do her master's thesis on abandoned coal mining operations in Harlan County. She was specifically interested in environmental remediation, the process of healing land that had been torn apart by extraction. She obtained permission to survey several old mine sites, and among them was a location that the maps identified simply as Sealed Site 47. No other information was provided, but the coordinates placed it in the Rattlesnake Hollow area, and she decided to include it in her survey. She hiked in with her equipment in late spring, when the mountain laurel was blooming and the forest was alive with birdsong. She found the site without difficulty, a clearing that showed signs of former development, though nature had largely reclaimed it. And in the center of the clearing, partially exposed by erosion, was a section of concrete, massive and old and cracked with age. She took samples. She photographed everything. She measured radiation levels and soil acidity and air quality, and she found anomalies that she couldn't explain. The concrete was warm to the touch, significantly warmer than the surrounding environment. The air near it had elevated levels of sulfur compounds. And when she placed a seismograph to measure normal earth tremors, it picked up a regular, rhythmic pattern that repeated every 8.3 seconds. Like a heartbeat. Like breathing. She spent 3 days documenting the site, and on the final day, she decided to take a core sample from the concrete itself, wanting to analyze its composition. She set up her coring drill, started the motor, and began cutting into the surface. She got about 6 inches deep when the drill bit broke, snapped clean through despite being diamond-tipped and designed to cut through much harder materials. And as she pulled the broken bit out, she noticed that something was seeping from the hole she'd made. A black substance, thick and oily, that emerged slowly and pooled on the concrete surface. She collected a sample in a vial, sealed it, and labeled it for later analysis. But she also noticed something else. The regular rhythm the seismograph had been recording changed. It accelerated. 8.3 seconds became 7 seconds, then 6, then 5, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse in synchronization. She packed her equipment quickly, suddenly overwhelmed by the feeling that she'd done something wrong, that she'd disturbed something that should have been left alone. And as she hiked out of the hollow, she swore she could hear sounds following her. Not footsteps exactly, but movement, something large adjusting its position in spaces far below. She made it back to her car and drove directly to the university, not stopping except for gas. Her professor examined the sample she'd collected and sent it to a lab for analysis. The results came back inconclusive. The substance was primarily organic, carbon-based, but its structure didn't match any known organism. It appeared to be partially mineralized, transformed by extreme pressure and time into something that was neither living nor dead, existing in a state that defied normal biological categories. The professor recommended further investigation, possibly excavation of the site, to determine what lay beneath the concrete seal. But before those plans could be implemented, the student received a visit from 2 men who identified themselves as representatives of a legal firm based in Pittsburgh. They were polite but firm. The site she'd investigated was private property. Her presence there had been unauthorized. The samples she'd collected were stolen goods. They could pursue legal action, or she could simply hand over all her research, all her samples, all her photographs, and sign a non-disclosure agreement promising never to speak about the site or her findings. She signed. She had student loans and no money for lawyers, and the men seemed to know exactly which threats would work. They took everything, even her field notebook, and left her with a copy of the NDA and a check for $5,000, which they described as compensation for her time and cooperation. She finished her master's thesis on a different topic and never went back to Harlan County. But sometimes, late at night, she wakes from dreams of darkness and depth, and she remembers the feeling of the ground pulsing beneath her feet, and she wonders what would have happened if she'd drilled deeper, if she'd broken through the seal completely. She wonders, but she doesn't investigate. Some things she's learned are better left undisturbed. The black substance from her sample sits now in a secure storage facility in an undisclosed location, one of dozens of similar samples collected over the years from sites across Appalachia. Whenever someone digs too deep or finds something they shouldn't, certain organizations take notice. They've been doing it for over a century, quietly cleaning up incidents, suppressing information, ensuring that the general public remains unaware of what lies beneath the mountains. It's not a government conspiracy or a corporate cover-up in the traditional sense. It's something older and more organic, a loose network of people who've encountered the truth and decided that protecting it outweighs the value of transparency. Because what good would it do to tell people? What would they do with the knowledge that there are places in the earth where the boundaries between possible and impossible become thin? That there are things in the deep places that humanity never encountered in its climb toward civilization because those things exist in spaces we don't normally reach? The coal seams protected us, ironically, creating a barrier of compressed carbon that sealed away deeper chambers. But in mining that coal, in following it into the mountain's heart, we've started to break those seals. And what was sealed away is patient. It doesn't need to rush. It can wait for the next incursion, the next desperate group of men digging in the dark, thinking they're just pursuing resources when they're actually opening doors that were closed for reasons lost to time. In Harlan County, the breathing continues. In other locations across Appalachia, similar sounds are reported with increasing frequency. And around the world, wherever humans dig deep enough, there are incidents. Mining disasters attributed to gas explosions or flooding or structural failure, but which share certain characteristics: the smell, the black substance, the changed behavior of the earth itself. The records exist if you know where to look, scattered across governmental archives and corporate files and personal diaries, forming a pattern that no one wants to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that our expansion, our progress, our relentless exploitation of the Earth's resources has consequences we're not prepared to face. The men of Rattlesnake Hollow didn't die for coal. They died because they were in the wrong place when humanity's ambition intersected with something far older than our species, something that has its own rhythms and purposes that we can't comprehend. And they're still down there, in a sense, not as bodies anymore. Whatever they became in those final moments, whatever the black substance did to them as it rose past their knees and their waists and their chests and finally their mouths and eyes, that's what they are now. Part of the darkness, part of the deep, part of what waits for the next group of miners to dig too far, to open the seals again, to let the breathing emerge into the upper world. Virgil Makepeace's amber eyes, which earned him the nickname Hawk, which saw things others missed, they're closed now, have been for over a century. But in the darkness beneath Harlan County, in spaces that shouldn't exist according to any geological survey, there are other eyes, and they're watching, waiting, patient beyond human comprehension because they measure time in epochs rather than years, in the rising and falling of mountain ranges rather than the span of individual lives. The mountain remembers, the earth remembers. And deep beneath the surface, where men in 1897 followed a coal seam into places they should never have reached, something waits with the patience of stone and the hunger of flame. And all it needs is for someone to dig deep enough to break the seal one more time. Until then, it breathes, in and out, rattling through miles of abandoned tunnels and sealed shafts, drawing air from the surface world and exhaling it back, changed, tainted, wrong. And on certain nights, when the conditions are right, people in Harlan County hear it, and they close their windows, and they don't speak about what they've heard, because speaking gives it power, gives it attention, gives it reality beyond the boundaries of nightmare. They know, in the way that knowledge passes through communities without ever being explicitly stated, that there are places in the mountains where you don't go. Places where the earth itself is sick with something that predates humanity's presence on this continent. Something that was here when the first people crossed the land bridge from Asia. Something that will still be here long after our civilization has crumbled into dust. The coal mines of Appalachia are closed now, mostly. The easily accessible seems exhausted and the remaining coal too expensive to extract. But there's talk of reopening some operations, of using new technology to reach deposits that were previously inaccessible. And every time that conversation starts, somewhere in the network of people who know the truth, someone makes a phone call or sends a message, or exerts quiet pressure to ensure that certain areas remain off limits. Not all of them. They can't protect everywhere. But the most dangerous places, the ones where the seals are thinnest and the breathing is loudest, those they guard without ever admitting what they're guarding against. And so we live in a world where most people believe that the earth is simply a ball of rock and metal, resources to be extracted and utilized, a passive stage for human activity. They don't know about the spaces between, the places where the world is stranger and more dangerous than any horror story, because horror stories have endings, and this doesn't. This just continues. Generation after generation, men digging and sometimes not coming back, and the stories getting told and forgotten and told again, and all the while the breathing goes on. In and out. In and out. Virgil and his crew have been down there for 129 years now. The concrete seal that entombed them is cracked with age, weakened by a century of freeze-thaw cycles and root growth, and the slow but inexorable movement of the earth itself. Eventually, that seal will fail completely. Eventually, the path will be open again, and when that happens, what emerges will be something that remembers what it was like to be human, but isn't anymore. Something that has had over a century to adapt to the darkness and the pressure and whatever else exists in those deep places. Something that will come up looking for the world it left behind and finding instead a world that has forgotten it ever existed. Or maybe it won't come up at all. Maybe it's content down there, having found or become or merged with whatever it was that made those sounds in the dark, whatever drew the cage deeper when it should have stayed stationary. Maybe Virgil Makepeace and his crew are happy in their way, having transcended the brief, brutal existence of coal miners in 1897 and achieved a kind of immortality that we surface dwellers can't comprehend. Maybe, but probably not. Probably they're aware, in whatever form awareness takes for them now, and they're waiting. Waiting for someone to break the seal. Waiting to share what they've become. Waiting to pull more people down into the darkness because misery doesn't just love company. It demands it, requires it, needs it, like the mountain needs breath. So, if you ever find yourself hiking in Harlan County, if you ever come across a clearing that feels wrong in ways you can't articulate, if you ever see concrete where concrete shouldn't be and feel warmth radiating from it on a cold day, do yourself a favor. Turn around, walk away. Don't investigate. Don't take samples. Don't try to understand. Because understanding has a price, and it's one that was paid in full by 43 men in October of 1897, and they're still paying it now, still down there in the darkness beneath the mountains where the earth breathes, and old things wait, and the only constant is the sound of descent without end. The mountain remembers, the earth remembers, and now you remember too. What do you think? Do you believe there are places in this world that should be left undisturbed, sealed away, and forgotten? Or is our curiosity too strong, our need to know too powerful, to ever truly leave the deep places alone. Let me know in the comments what you think. And if you ever hear stories about abandoned mines or sealed facilities in your area, maybe think twice before you go exploring. Sometimes the things we seal away are sealed for reasons we've forgotten but shouldn't have. This has been Behind Dark Tales. Until next time, stay safe and stay in the light.